Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Meg Hunter-Kilmer will share with us how the sufferings and struggles of the saints are a model of hope and faith, and introduce us to some of our new heavenly friends. And we have a little bit of a different scenario here. Meg is here with us. So we're super excited about that and that you all have joined us today. I'm Erin Pierce. I'm the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will answer as many of those as possible at the end of the webinar today. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Meg Hunter-Kilmer is a Catholic speaker, author, retreat leader, and itinerant missionary whose work appears regularly on Aletheia and on her blog, Held by His Pierced Hands. Hunter-Kilmer is the author of Saints Around the World. She has written for Magnificat, Our Sunday Visitor, The Catechetical Review, and Take Up and Read. She has appeared on a variety of Catholic media, including Catholic TV, Sirius XM's The Catholic Channel, Relevant Radio, and Ave Maria Radio. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree at the University of Notre Dame and previously served as a teacher, youth minister, and campus minister, and has recently published Pray for Us. So Meg, so awesome for you to be here with us today. Here we go. Whoops. I'm going to go ahead
with the technology here.
Yes. Give us 1 second. I'm going to pull up other PowerPoint. Here we go. And camera. There you go.
All right. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about some of my dearest saint friends. I wanted to share, as we prepare for All Saints Day coming up at the beginning of next month, I wanted to share about some of the saints that we don't necessarily hear about, and particularly the aspect of the saints that I think we really hunger for as a church, particularly a modern church, the brokenness of the saints. It's very easy to focus on the triumphs of the saints, to focus on the mysticism of the saints and the miracles of the saints and the bland piety of some of the saints. And often the way that we tell the stories of the saints, they sound entirely unattainable, which is the opposite of the purpose of the saints. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And he's not saying, you guys, I am as good as Jesus, so check me out. He's saying, look, we are all trying to imitate Jesus, and sometimes we need a stepping stone on the way. Can you imitate me the way that I imitate Jesus? And so when we look to the saints, we're looking to saints who had anger issues like St. Paul did, saints who dealt with addiction, saints who dealt with mental illness, saints who had dysfunctional families. When we see the brokenness of the saints, it gives us hope in our lives. And I can't tell you, in my years on the road telling these stories to people, I can't tell you how many people have gasped with this light in their eyes because the stories of these saints gives them permission to be loved by Jesus. You know, the devil is on his game, and he wants to tell us, you are unlovable because of your divorce, because of your abortion, because of the way that your mother used to speak to you, because of your deep and abiding love for musical theater, you know, whatever it is. We just hear again and again that we are not enough, that we aren't who God wants us to be. And you know what? There is growth that is needed. Absolutely, there is growth that is needed. But God didn't mess up when he made us, and he didn't abandon us in the circumstances that make us feel unlovable. And so I think when we get to know these saints, and particularly for those of us who are working in ministry, when we're able to share the stories of these saints with people who are suffering, it does It does beautiful work in drawing people deeper into the heart of Jesus, because they hear these stories and they know that it is possible for them to be loved in their circumstances. So we're going to start with St. Mark G. Tianxiang. St. Mark G. Tianxiang is a dear friend of mine, and probably the story that I have seen the most significant response to. Mark G. Tianxiang was an opium addict. Not used to be an opium addict. He was an opium addict at the time of his death. Mark grew up in a Catholic family in China, and he was a doctor serving the poor for free, making his mom proud. He's a pillar of the Christian community, one of the leaders in the church, and he got a stomach ailment, and he treated himself with laudanum, which is an opiate, and was in absolutely typical medical treatment at the time, as many opioids are even today. But he became addicted, and he kept going to confession, and he kept confessing using opium. And finally, his priest, God rest his soul, who did not understand addiction and did not understand confession, said to him, you know what? You're clearly not sorry, because if you were sorry, you would stop doing it. I'm not absolving you until you get clean, which, as you and I know, is not the way that confession works. It's not the way that addiction works. Addiction isn't a function of a lack of willpower, right? It's a physiological issue. And we know that you don't go to confession saying, I'm never going to sin again, because then you got pride to check off there, right? You go to confession saying, I want to be who God made me to be. I don't want to be trapped by this sin. But knowing that you're going to fail is a very different thing from wanting to fail. This priest didn't understand it. And Mark G. Tianxiang, he could have looked at that and been like, you know what, I'm done. I'm done, because you're treating me like garbage. You treat me like I'm this wicked man when I'm broken and I'm suffering and I'm trying to be better and I just can't manage it. And I think many of us would have walked away. But St. Mark G. Tianxiang was a saint, and he showed up every Sunday for 30 years. And for 30 years, he prayed that he would die a martyr, because he was convinced it's the only way that he could be saved. And at the end of 30 years, in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion broke out. And these rebels were going after anything excessively Western, particularly Christians who they viewed as being Westernized. And they came into Tianxiang's town, and they went to his house. And I'm sure his neighbors were like, that guy can't go 6 hours without a hit. He's not going to stay strong for Jesus. And he went with them, with his children and his grandchildren. His grandson said, Grandpa, where are they taking us? And he said, baby, they're taking us home. And he asked his captors only one favor. He said, I ask that you kill me last. I don't want anybody in my family to die alone. And he went to his death singing the litany of the Blessed Virgin Mary, an opium addict and a canonized saint, because nothing is too big for God's mercy. And I've been thinking about him a lot lately, because I think for a long time, the way I was telling the story was like, look, God was still working even in his addiction. But I think I want to say God was still working through his addiction, because we don't know if he would have had the grace of perseverance to be a martyr had he not spent 30 years persevering under the dirty looks that he got from people, under the anger of his priest, under the self-recrimination and the shame, persevering through all of that. Maybe it was those 30 years of living in addiction that made it possible in the end for him to be a saint. I'm not going to say that his opium use was good, but I'm going to say that God was at work in that. And in not delivering him, God was at work as well, because those decades made him the man who was able to be a saint in the end. And I think when we look at our own lives, at our own habitual sin, at our own struggles and sufferings, at our own friends and family who are dealing with addiction, it gives us so much hope to see God at work in all of that.
Let's put these on.
Oh,
I think maybe tell us if the sound is better.
yeah.
Let us know, is the sound better?
Use new heart. Look at that.
All right, friends. Is there a chat box where they can tell us we sound good?
Question.
Let us know. Do we sound good? Ah, the sound is better. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Tiffany. Oh, you couldn't hear me at all. Could you hear that story at all? Well, you will just have to pray for us, and you will be. Oh, you did hear it. Okay, great. Okay, so it maybe wasn't fantastic, but his story is in here. He's wonderful. Let's go ahead and talk about some more new saint friends. There we go. Next is Saint Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy. Saint Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy was a Vietnamese man, and he's another who really struggles with temptation to sin. So he was a Christian man, and he was very successful in his career. He was one of the chief silk merchants in the kingdom. And because of his success, there we go. Because of his success, he was involved in a lot of things that were really danger to his soul, right? The kingdom of Vietnam at the time was not a Christian kingdom, and so there would have been pagan ceremonies that he would attend, and we're not entirely sure if he participated in them, but either way, he really became sort of really affected by this culture around him, and he ended up entering into an adulterous relationship. He was a married man, he had children, but he also had a mistress at the palace where he lived for much of the time that he was working. And he had 3 children with his mistress, and he baptized each one of them Catholic. Sort of a fascinating thing to see this man who is living in what seems to be unrepentant sin, since he's having child after child after child with his mistress, but also who has a desire for his children to know Jesus in a culture where that was not the norm at the time. And he is wrestling with this for a number of years. And at a certain point, he has this major conversion, and he leaves his mistress, and he begins to try to earn the mercy of God, which, as we know, is not the way God's mercy works. But he begins to do these great works of charity. He ransomed 2 girls from slavery, and he adopted them. He allowed an opium addict to move into his house, and he cared for that man until his death. He sent his son to seminary, and it's, beautiful things. But he said to a friend of his, we have to do these great works of charity to earn the love of God, to earn the salvation of God, which is not how God's love works. It's not how salvation works. So he's a beautiful saint for those who are dealing with scrupulosity, right? Because here he is, he's repented, been to confession, he's been forgiven, and he's sitting there thinking, God can't really love me in this, right? I have to earn this. And then eventually gets arrested for being a Christian, and he betrays the Christians in his community. And I believe 8 Christians recanted. They denied Jesus, apostatized, and another several dozen were sent into exile. And it was his fault, because after all of those years of trying to earn God's love, of trying to earn God's grace, it still wasn't enough. And so there he is in prison, having failed in this horrific way that led, as far as he could tell, to the loss of souls. And a priest managed to sneak into the prison and to bring him God's mercy even there. And that was the real turning point for St. Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy, that he realized that God's mercy was not contingent on his doing all of the right things, that it was a free gift that was offered him. And he finally was able to embrace that freedom and to reject the scrupulosity that had plagued him for so many years. He ended up going to his death, and it's great because he's just in such peace over his impending death. He smokes a last cigarette. He fixes his hair and fixes his clothes. And as he's going to his death, he's absolved again by 2 more priests who are hidden in the crowd. And he dies this glorious martyr's death. But I love Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy, both for people who maybe have fallen into adultery, but also for people who have felt that terrible scourge of scrupulosity and that conviction that you're unloved, or that you have to do all of the right things. And here's a man who can say, look, I have been there, restarting the rosary 35 times because you think that if you get it exactly right, then God's going to love you more, or then you won't be condemned. And Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy is like, look, it's not about what you do, right? God asks you to participate with his grace, but mercy is a gift, salvation is a gift, and God's love is a gift, and you can't earn it. Venerable Cornelia Connolly is a woman who suffered grievously. Michael Ho-Dinh-Hy shows us the story of the repentant adulterer, right? The repentant member of a couple who had so wounded the other. Cornelia Connolly is the wounded spouse. So she's an American woman. She was from the East Coast, and she was Episcopalian. She married an Episcopalian man. He was a priest, and they moved out to the frontier. And she suffered so bitterly. Her baby died, and then her toddler fell into a vat of boiling maple sugar and cooked from the outside in. I mean, they rescued him, they pulled him out, but he died very, very slowly and very painfully. And then her husband decided he wanted to become Catholic, which is great, except that he was a horrific narcissist. His name is Pierce, and I should pray for him more than I talk trash about him, for the repose of his soul. But he decided that he wanted to be a celebrity priest. Right? If he converts to Catholicism and he becomes a priest, everybody's going to know how amazing he is, and they're all going to be so impressed with him. Well, at the time, for a convert who was married to become a priest, he had to separate from his wife. And Cornelia begged her husband. She said, I am still grieving the loss of those 2 babies. We have 3 small children. Please do not leave me. And he was like, oh, no, I'm going to be a huge deal. And her understanding of Christian marriage did not include standing up for her rights or for the rights of her marriage. And she felt that if this is what her husband wanted, that's what she had to do. And so Cornelia consented, and she and her husband separated, and he was ordained a priest, and she began a religious order. And she was getting her life back together. You know, her kids were at boarding school, but she got to see them sometimes. And she's founding this religious order, and she's exercising her spiritual motherhood. And then along comes Pierce, who apparently wasn't loving celibacy. And he comes knocking at the door of her convent, and he's like, I want you back. And she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, no, I want you back. And she's like, look, we made vows. He's, well, we made vows before that. And, you know, at this point, she sort of figured out that he is not a great guy. And she puts her foot down and she says, I'm not coming back to you. This is clearly where God has called me, and I didn't want it, but I'm going to embrace the life that I've been given. And he sued her for conjugal rights. In England in the 19th century, you can imagine the field day the press had with that. Right? I mean, just this disaster, and here's this lurid affair between a Catholic priest and his nun wife, and everybody's insinuating that she's having an affair with the cardinal. He sues her for conjugal rights, wins. Her lawyers appeal, and they get it overturned. So he kidnaps her children and takes them away to Italy and poisons them against her so that they hate their mother and they hate the church. One of her children died young, hating her. One of her children made it to adulthood, never reconciled with his mother. The third was reconciled to Mother Cornelia and to the church. And here she is with all of this suffering, living religious life, forming young women in this new religious community. And one of the novices said to her one time, Mother Cornelia, you have suffered so much. Why are you always smiling? And we expect the answer to be, well, because Jesus is good, and so my life is rainbows and butterflies. But that's not an authentic depiction of the reality of the Christian life. And it's not what most of the saints said. Cornelia looked at this young woman and she said, my child, the tears are always running down the back of my throat. And I love that honesty where she's like, look, I don't have time to sit around feeling sorry for myself 24 hours a day, decades after all of this suffering. But I don't have to pretend the grief isn't there. I don't have to pretend that this was all okay. I don't have to stop missing my children. I can sit in the honesty of saying, this is awful, and God is still good. I am miserable at times, but I have work to do. And that grief doesn't have to define me, but it also isn't something that I have to ignore in order to count myself a good Christian. Blessed Catalina de Maria Rodriguez was a Latin American woman. She felt called to religious life, but at the time in Argentina, there were no active religious communities, and she felt very called to be an active religious sister. And so her spiritual director, normally would say, go to a different country to be an active religious sister, or found an active religious community in this country. No, this guy instead said, well, you should marry my buddy. And Saturnina was her birth name. Saturnina said, I don't want to marry your buddy. And his buddy, who was a widower who had 2 children, went to Saturnina and was like, if you don't marry me, I'm going to kill myself. And so she goes back to her spiritual director and is like, he said if I don't marry him, he's going to kill myself. Now, I would hope that if you're ever in a situation like this, you recognize that that's not how we contract marriage, right? That that's emotional abuse, and that he needs to deal with his own stuff, and his mental health is not her job. She wasn't even dating the man. Her spiritual director says to her, yep, and if he does, it's your fault. So she doesn't know what else to do, right? She's pressured into this marriage that she doesn't want. And she becomes a stepmother to these 2 young children, raises these 2 children, dealing with infertility. She has 1 biological child who was stillborn, named Catalina. And then her husband died when they had been married for a little over a decade. And finally, Saturnina was like, okay, now I'm going to do the work that I think that God has been calling me to do. But she recognized that that time wasn't wasted. The Lord was giving her the heart of a mother during that time. So she ends up founding a religious order in Argentina, takes the name Sister Catalina, then Mother Catalina, after her little girl who she was still grieving. And she does that. She begins this order, doing this work, preaching the spiritual exercises and providing education, particularly to women who didn't have opportunities for education. I think she's a really beautiful one for times when you look at your life and you say, this is not the life I would have chosen. Right. And I feel sort of out of control right now, but I trust that God is working. I trust that God is moving and that he's forming me. Is it a good thing that her husband pressured her into marriage? Absolutely not. Was it a valid marriage? Perhaps not. That's not really a conversation that needs to be had at this point, but you can look at her life and say none of that was okay and still say God was working. God was working in giving those 2 children a mother. God was working in giving life to little Catalina, even though she was stillborn. Her life mattered. Her soul exists for all eternity. And he was working in developing Blessed Catalina to be the woman that he needed her to be. Blessed Columba Kang Wan-suk had a similar situation where she looked at her life and she said, what is even going on? This is not the life I would have chosen. She was a South Korean woman, born in 1761, so before the gospel had been preached in Korea. Korea is a fascinating country. It's the only country to have evangelized itself. Every other country in the world had missionaries sent there. Korea had some teenagers who found a book, read it, said this looks true, smuggled one of their number out to get baptized, smuggled him back in, and started preaching the gospel. So Columba hears this gospel preached at the very beginning. She's in her mid-30s when she embraces Jesus, and she becomes this brilliant evangelist. And she converts her parents, and she converts her mother-in-law, and she converts her stepson, and she does not convert her husband. He was not interested in the gospel. He wasn't interested in meekness or gentleness. He wasn't interested in really anything that Columba had to say. And so he left her for a concubine. And it doesn't sound like he was the world's greatest husband in the first place. But, you know, divorce is never something that people are delighted about. They wanted their marriage to go well, even if divorce is the healthiest situation, the healthiest outcome to a certain situation. And obviously the church understands that for the protection of the innocent spouse, sometimes a civil divorce is necessary. And so here Columba is, having been divorced by her husband, and she's like, well, what do I do now? But Columba trusted that God was working, even in circumstances that she wouldn't have preferred. I'm sure she would rather that her husband had just been converted and become an incredible man. And here she is at a time when divorce was really stigmatized. She says, what am I supposed to do with this? And then she realizes that at the time, it was illegal for the police to search a noblewoman's house if her husband didn't live there with her. Right? So it's for the protection of noble women, right? That if you live alone as a noblewoman because you've been widowed or whatever, that the police can't come in. And so Columba's like, oh, maybe all the Christian women should live here. And she opens her home to all of these Christian women, particularly women who were trying to live lives of virginity. She becomes the center of the church in Korea at the time. There is a priest who was smuggled in. He's the only priest in Korea for the first 50 years that there are Catholics in Korea. There's one priest for 6 years total. His name is Blessed James Ju Wenmo, and he was himself an undocumented immigrant from China. And he comes in and he's serving the church in Korea, and Columba is in charge, right? Because his Korean isn't great, so she's doing a lot of translating. She's also the primary catechist for the women in the community, and she's a smuggler, right? She's smuggling him from one place to another. She's the one protecting him. This woman is the backbone of the Christian community in Korea, and it's because of this divorce. It's because God was still working when she was enduring this great hardship. Eventually, she's arrested for being a Christian, and Blessed James Ju Wenmo and Blessed Philip Hong Pil-ju, Columba's stepson, they presented themselves to the police to try and ransom her. Instead, they were all martyred, leaving Blessed Columba Kang Wan-suk, this glorious martyr and this great, hopefully soon to be saint, because in the circumstances of her life that she wouldn't have chosen, she was able to trust that God was working. She's also a really great friend if you have mother-in-law issues, because when her husband left her, her mother-in-law stayed with Columba because they loved each other so much. And because her mother-in-law was so thoroughly converted, she said, I want to be with my Christian ex-daughter-in-law over my own son. St. Leopold Mandic, he's a dear friend of mine. Many of the people we're talking about today are dear friends of mine, but Leopold he's a special one. He was a Croatian man who was lived in the late 19th, early 20th century, and all he wanted in life was to work to end the Great Schism. He wanted to reunite the East and the West, Catholics and Orthodox, and so he became a Capuchin Franciscan, because he knew this was the work that God was calling him to. And they sent him to Italy, where there are not really any Orthodox. And Father Leopold obeyed. He went where he was sent, but he kept going back to his superiors. He kept saying, I know this is the work that God has called me to. I know this is what the Lord is leading me to. And they kept saying, thank you very much. Go back to the confessional. And he would sit in the confessional for 12 or 14 hours a day, and he would pray for 4 or 6 hours every night for his penitence. And he consoled himself that every confession he heard was a small act of reconciliation, a small way of bringing the body of Christ back together. But he continued to long for that work. And finally, his superior sent him to Croatia. He packed his things and he went to Croatia, and a week later he gets a letter saying, come back. Because the people missed their confessor and they're rioting in the streets practically because they want Father Leopold back. And again, if it were me, I think I would be like, no, I finally get to do the thing I want to do. Tell the people to deal with it. Like, Padre Pio's not that far away. They can hop on a train. You know, they can figure it out. And Father Leopold returned. And he spent the rest of his life in Padua, sitting in that confessional. And just a few months before he died, he said, now I am convinced that God is going to send me as an apostle to the East to bring the Orthodox back into union with his church. And then he died. He never experienced the fulfillment of the deep desire of his heart. And he died a happy man because he died obedient. He died faithful. He died in the arms of Jesus. I have spent a lot of my life longing and hoping, and I have spent a lot of my life hearing the Lord say no. And there's something beautiful about the stories of the saints who hoped and wished and prayed and longed and worked and finally got their heart's desire. But when I hear those stories, it's very easy for me then to fixate on the possible outcome and to trust that God will give me what I want. That's not what he promised. He promised that he would give me himself. When I look at Leopold Mandic, I'm able to sit in that uncertainty and that unfulfilled longing and say, God is here and he is working right now. And it is good to be in his will, even if his will is the exact opposite of what I would have chosen. St. Marguerite Bay was a beautiful Swiss woman, very, very relevant to our lives today. She just had this miserable, dysfunctional family. And she, she's a mystic, and she had the stigmata, and she lived on the Eucharist alone for a couple of decades, and she would make these like 100-mile walking pilgrimages through the Swiss Alps. She's like doing the typical saint stuff. But what made her a saint wasn't all those headlining things. What made her a saint was that she loved her mess of a family. She loved her brother who was in and out of jail. She loved her brother who was a mayor. She loved them both when they were in the same room at Thanksgiving, which cannot have been easy for anybody. She loved her sister who had a failed marriage and came home weeping. She loved her illegitimate nephew. She loved her sister-in-law who couldn't stand her. I mean, it's our lives, isn't it? With all of the complexity of family life. And Marguerite could have moved out, right? She could have entered religious life. She could certainly have found someone to marry her. She's an amazing woman. Everybody loves her. And she lived with her brother and his wife who couldn't stand her, and his illegitimate child who Marguerite raised while the boy's stepmother refused to acknowledge him. And Marguerite loved them. And when her sister-in-law taunted her and ridiculed her for wasting time by going to Mass, Marguerite loved her. She loved her so well that she changed her heart. And her sister-in-law at the end of her life wanted nobody but Marguerite to nurse her. Not because she had come in saying, all right, look, you're kind of a jerk, and here's the way you need to deal with this. And here's my political perspective. And here's all of the ways that you're wrong and your conspiracy theories are nuts. No. Marguerite loved her. Gently and quietly loved her. Loved all of her family in all of their mess. And for her, that's what made her a saint. I think it's so encouraging to see somebody who didn't have these like huge, egregious faults, who just had the difficulty of regular, ordinary, everyday life. Because sometimes that brokenness seems the most impossible to survive. Servant of God Darwin Ramos, very, very new, 1994 to 2012, was a Filipino boy, grew up in the slums of Manila. His dad was a drunk. Darwin and his sister would go out picking through the garbage when he was very small, 4 or 5 years old. But eventually he started to get weak and his balance was off. His mother managed to take him to a doctor. God love her. The doctor looked at her and said, it's obviously malnutrition. You should try harder to feed your children. It wasn't malnutrition. It was muscular dystrophy. That's the reason that he was getting weaker. That's the reason that he lost the ability to walk. And so he couldn't go out and pick through the garbage anymore. And his dad, who was not the world's loveliest man, was like, oh, this is great. You look pathetic. You should go beg on a corner. And Darwin obviously does not like being told that he looks pathetic. He doesn't like being used in this way. He doesn't like setting himself up as an object of pity, right? He doesn't see his disability as something that should cause people to feel sorry for him. But he wants his siblings to be able to eat. And this is how he can make money for them. So he goes out and he begs every day and he hates it. And you can see the smile on his face. I mean, he's just this brilliantly joyful boy, and it was slowly killing him. The shame and the anger at his father. And then some social workers came along. They found him and they said, hey, we have a home for children with disabilities. Would you like to come live with us? And he spoke to his family and his family agreed. And so he moved into this Christian home. And Darwin had always loved Jesus. His mother had taught him to love Jesus, but he had never been baptized, never received his first communion. So you take this latent love of the Lord, and he moves into this Catholic home, and now he's receiving the sacraments and he's leading people in prayer. And they called him their teacher of joy, because for Darwin, the Lord had given so much. Here's this young boy who lives in the slums, barely getting by, alcoholic dad. Now he's dealing with this disability. He's separated from his family, but he was just radiant with the love of Jesus. And he eventually died from complications of his illness. But it's a beautiful thing because he died in 2012, right? So we have like cell phone videos of him laughing with people. And the people who knew him, they said, he didn't do anything spectacular. He loved well. And the way that he talks about suffering, he said, Jesus gave me this suffering so that I could love him better. And I think for those of us whose suffering is less extreme than Darwin's, it's really challenging, but also healing to look at what he says about suffering and to say, it's possible for me to embrace my suffering with a similar grace. St. Agatha Kim Agi is one of my very favorite stories to tell. She's a Korean woman living, again, around the time of the beginning of Catholicism in Korea, but she didn't learn about Jesus until sometime later. And when she did, she was all in. I mean, she like went and broke her husband's idols and, then had to deal with the fallout from that. You can see the picture of St. Agatha Kim Agi. There aren't really any good pictures of her available. So this is from my other book, which is called Saints Around the World. It's 100 stories of saints from nearly 70 different countries. It's a children's book that has some overlap with some of these saints, but many, many other new friends. Well, Agatha Kim Agi had a severe learning disability, possibly to the point of being intellectually disabled. She could not learn anything. And she wanted to be baptized, so she went to the Christian community and she said, I love Jesus and Mary. And they said, that's great. Can you recite the creed for us? And she said, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they said, okay, how about the Our Father? And she said, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they said, okay, repeat after us. Hail Mary, full of grace. And she said, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they said, you are too dumb to baptize, which is not a thing, right? But remember how there hadn't been really any priests at all, and it was just a bunch of lay people who had been trying to figure things out, like to the point that for a while laymen were celebrating Mass because they hadn't understood that you had to be ordained for that. We're going to cut them some slack on their sacramental theology there. The government doesn't care, though, that Agatha isn't baptized. They arrest her for being a Christian. And they bring her in and they torture her and they say, deny Jesus. And she says, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they said, tell us where the other Christians are hiding. And she says, I only know Jesus and Mary. And her great shame became her crowning glory. And when she was thrown back in the prison, the other Christians bowed before her and they said, here is Agatha who only knows Jesus and Mary. And they baptized her and she died a martyr and is a canonized saint. We've got all kinds of geniuses in our church, but that's not what made them saints. It was knowing Jesus and Mary. And your particular issue, your struggle, your disability, your cross, the thing that gives you great shame might not be an intellectual disability, but whatever it is that you're struggling with, the Lord can use that. He can use that to bring glory to his name, and he can transform you in and through it. St. Mary of Egypt is often called a prostitute. She was not a prostitute. She didn't accept money. She was a nymphomaniac and a rapist. We actually have in the earliest biography of her that she coerced men even against their will. And eventually she had this enormous conversion. And she went out into the desert to live a life of penance. And what I love about Mary of Egypt is she didn't have one of those conversions where then she was so holy and she never sinned again. For 17 years, she had lived in her sin. And for 17 years, she struggled with shame and with temptation. The devil would appear to her in the guise of comely young men, and she kept fighting. And I think there's something so encouraging in this woman who wasn't immediately set free. For us to know that when we're fighting against our inclination to sin, we are not alone. We are surrounded by saints who are like, oh yeah, no, I know. It does not come easy. Sometimes it takes decades, but God is at work even there. St. Mary of Edessa and St. Abraham Kijunaya. Abraham was Mary's adoptive father. So Mary was 7 when she was orphaned, and her uncle Abraham adopted her. He was a monk and he raised her as a little hermitess. And she lived as a hermitess for 20 years and then met a wayward monk who very slowly over the course of a year groomed her and then assaulted her. But Mary didn't have that language for it, and she blamed herself, as is so often the case in instances of sexual assault, particularly clerical sexual abuse. The survivors blame themselves, and Mary blamed herself after she was assaulted by this priest. And she said, well, this is all I am. And it's all I've ever gonna be. Like, now that I've messed up like this, God couldn't possibly want me. And she ran off to become a prostitute. And Abraham realized what had happened, but he didn't know where his little girl had gone. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed. And finally, God gave him a vision of where Mary was. And he left his hermitage for the first time in decades. And he went to find his little girl. He's a monk too, he's a priest. And he goes into this brothel and he asks for Mary. And he's taken up to her room, and Mary comes in prepared to do the work she'd become accustomed to. And Abraham falls on his knees and says, sweet girl, come home. This is not who you are. Jesus has already forgiven you. This was not your fault, but you don't have to stay here. And he begs her, weeping. And finally, she's like, look, I know he's not going to leave, so fine, I'll come back. But she thinks I'll have to spend the rest of my life doing penance, like having been a hermitess and having fallen this far, you know. And maybe at that point she was able to understand that the abuse was not her fault, but she's also dealing with, you know, what she chose in the wake of that assault. She thinks, I'm just going to have to do penance the rest of my life. And the Lord allowed her to do penance for 2 years. And then he was like, no, I need you to know that you are forgiven and made new. And he made her a miracle worker. And she spent the rest of her life working miracles, a testimony to what God can do when we let him love us in our brokenness. Servants of God, Cyprian and Daphrose Rugamba were a married couple in Rwanda in the 20th century. Cyprian was a seminarian, lost his faith, became a very angry atheist, dabbled in some traditional pagan practices in Rwanda. He's also a brilliant musician and a choreographer and a composer. He's leading this renaissance in Rwandan culture in the wake of colonialism. And he marries Daphrose because he had been engaged to her cousin, and her cousin was killed. And so he marries her out of sort of an obligation. And Daphrose is a faithful Catholic. And Cyprian is the kind of man who walks into his wife's room after she's had a baby and breaks the crucifix on the floor of the hospital room. That's how much he hated the church, and he was a philanderer. They had 10 children together. Cyprian had 11 because he was an adulterer. They lost their first child to miscarriage, and when their second child was born healthy, after a few months, Cyprian kicked Daphrose out, made her leave her baby behind, accused her of witchcraft. Right? I mean, just a really, really broken marriage. And Daphrose is trying to love him, and she's trying to pray for him. And maybe, I don't know, maybe she should have left. It doesn't seem that he was physically abusive. Certainly there was emotional abuse, infidelity. Maybe he should have left. She should have left, but Daphrose stayed and she prayed for him. And Cyprian ends up having this enormous conversion. And he begs Daphrose's forgiveness, and she forgives him. What I love about Daphrose and about Cyprian, look at her face. She is looking at that man like the sun rises and sets on him. The mercy in their marriage, the fact that she was able really to forgive him and he was able really to accept that. They become the heart of this renewal of Catholicism in Rwanda. Also, we're taking a stand against ethnic prejudices and were killed in the Rwandan genocide. But what beautiful saints for Rwanda as they seek to recover from the genocide of 1994. They seek to offer mercy, and they seek to receive mercy, to have this couple that shows us what it is to offer and receive mercy. Beautiful intercessors when you're struggling in your marriage. I'm going to run through the last few really quickly so that we have a chance for questions, but I just want to pique your interest a little bit. Venerable Rutilio Grande was a Salvadoran priest, a Jesuit, friend of Oscar Romero. He had extreme mental illness. He was hospitalized with catatonic schizophrenia twice, and he was able to recognize that God was at work in his mental illness. He's friends with St. Oscar Romero, who had obsessive compulsive disorder. These two men are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, opposite sides of the liturgical spectrum, opposite sides of the theological spectrum, and we're dear, dear friends. So wonderful intercessors for our time, both because of the mental illness they experienced, because of their work for justice, but also because of the way that they were able to be friends, even with those great differences. It was Rutilio's death that was the catalyst for Oscar Romero's conversion to be a great man of justice. And finally, Jan Tiranovsky. I can't do his story justice in 30 seconds, so I'm going to tell you that you're going to have to grab the book. But I will tell you that he is an unemployed, or he's a blue-collar bachelor who lived with his mother and may be the reason that communism fell in the West. So you can check out Jan Tiranovsky to learn a little bit more about the connection there. And we will now open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much. All right. Pull up the question box here. Well, thank you, first of all, for sharing your passion with us. I'm curious as to how you became a friend of the saint.
You know, I wasn't always. I think I had just heard the stories told so badly that I thought, what on earth is the point of any of this? And I encountered Modern Saints by Anne Ball, which is a 2-volume work published in 1983. And she told the stories well. And she told the broken parts, and she told the suffering, and she told the struggle. And I was like, oh, hang on. This could actually be something really spectacular, because I've spent my life since my conversion when I was 13. I've spent my life trying to help people understand how much God loves them. And so many of us, we have some obstacle that makes us think that we're ineligible for God's love. And I can tell people again and again, it's not true. God loves you exactly as you are. He loves you exactly as you are. But to be able to say, no, I know somebody who had that exact experience, and he's a canonized saint. I know somebody who had a very similar experience whose cause for canonization is open. And to be able to name people's suffering and brokenness and to show what it looks like transformed by glory has just opened so many hearts to encounter Jesus. It's just been tremendous to see. And I've always been a storyteller. I just always told worthless stories. I was like, this one time when I was in 4th grade, a funny thing happened at my school assembly. I needed to tell stories. I didn't have any stories to tell. And so it was great to discover that I could tell these stories that were actually really important and could actually be life-giving for the church.
Well, you had me laughing and crying all in the midst of 40 minutes. Okay, you're a delightful presenter. What a wonderful way to learn and remember the stories of these amazing men and women. Thank you. Thank you for introducing us to her. Meg is an excellent storyteller. Absolutely.
Thank you, friends.
So much. So true.
If anybody is looking for a particular kind of saint, I'm really pretty good at saint matchmaking. So if you're like, okay, well, there's no way you've got a saint who was divorced and remarried, or there's no way you've got a saint who, whatever, fill in the blank, did gymnastics or loved Pokemon, or, all of that. I'm happy to do some matchmaking.
So if you guys have any questions for Meg, feel free to go ahead and put those in the question box. For the teens I work with, saints who dealt with suicidal ideation.
Hi, Laura. I was just telling someone about the fleece sheets at your house last night. I stayed with Laura in Belgium. Saints dealing with suicidal ideation, yes. And we have actually quite a few. So it was something that St. Ignatius Loyola struggled with. It was something that St. Therese, the little flower, struggled with. People get very angry when you suggest that, but it is not a sin to experience mental illness. It is not a moral failing. It is not evidence of a lack of holiness or a poverty to your prayer life. For her, it was probably part of her experience of tuberculosis. That does seem to be one of the symptoms of end-stage tuberculosis, is like severe and sudden onset of mental illness, particularly suicidal ideations. Dorothy Day is a servant of God, and she had 2 suicide attempts that she survived. Blessed Bartolo Longo, who is in this book, he was a former satanic high priest who had such shame after his conversion and was so so convinced that he couldn't be saved after all that he had done, that he almost killed himself, like was on the point of killing himself when he heard the Blessed Virgin Mary say, "Preach the Rosary." And, some people need to be told their identity in those moments of crisis, and some people need a task, and he needed a task. And so he went out and preached the Rosary, and St. John Paul II called him the man of Our Lady, which I think is awfully beautiful. Venerable Francis Lieberman is also a really good one. He actually had to be very cautious for really his whole life when he crossed bridges. He had a severe compulsion to throw himself off any bridge that he crossed for his entire life, and it's not a thing that he was really ever delivered from. So he's a great one for people who are dealing with that in sort of a chronic way. Also, go to therapy and take medication if that's what you need, because that is a good and holy and beautiful thing to do. Somebody asked how the saints with mental illness dealt with their condition. Those who lived at a time when there was therapy and medication, through therapy and medication. Blessed Basil Hopko actually was so severely mentally ill that he was released from a communist prison to go and get help. Like, you got to be really badly off for communists who have imprisoned you to take pity on you, right? And he actually, I think, got some electroshock therapy, because that was what was common at the time. He was hospitalized for a good chunk of time. Rutilio Grande was in and out of hospitals. Oscar Romero, I believe, took medication, although I don't know that for a fact. And Albert Chmielowski spent 9 months in a mental institution. Rose Hawthorne Lathrop, servant of God Rose Hawthorne Lathrop, was hospitalized for postpartum depression. We have a lot of saints who got medical help for their mental illness, because we don't pray away cancer, and we don't pray away depression, right? I mean, pray, but also get chemo and also take Zoloft, whatever it is that you need. The Lord works through those medications and through therapy and through various different counselors and all of these other things. And so that's a really beautiful thing to remember and to see in the lives of the saints.
Love that. We've got some questions of a saint who could help with sobriety.
Yes. So Mark G. Tianxiang, I love for that. But he did not ever actually attain sobriety. And so if you're looking for somebody who did, my favorite for that is Venerable Matt Talbot, also right in here. He was an Irishman, late 19th, early 20th century, and he was born into a family that dealt really severely with alcoholism. His father was an alcoholic. I think he had maybe 7 brothers, and 6 of them were alcoholics. There was one who wasn't. And so he started working in a vintner's shop, I believe, when he was 13, and he started drinking, and he just didn't stop. And he became a drunk. He was a drunk until he was 28. And at 28, he had, it's sort of an odd experience of grace. He was one who would always stand a drink for his friends when they didn't have any money. And he didn't have any money this one night, and nobody would buy him a drink. And sort of out of spite, he left and decided to stop drinking, which, God can work through that. God can work through anything. And he went home and he told his mom, he was like, "I'm done. I'm not drinking anymore." And she was like, "Don't make that promise if you're not going to keep it. I can't do this again." And he was like, "No, I'm done." And he took a pledge that he would never drink again. And for the next 40 years, he never touched a drop of alcohol, and he never stopped being an alcoholic. Some people are like really just released from that, and that is beautiful for them. But I love the ones who aren't, because I love seeing how God works in that struggle. For the rest of his life, he never carried money with him, because it was a temptation to go into a pub and buy a pint. At the end of his life, he was still saying, "It is easier for God to raise the dead than to free a man of the desire to drink." I mean, just a beautiful testimony. He's a very simple man. He's working as a day laborer. Beautiful testimony that grace doesn't make virtue easy, it just makes it possible. And to have him walking along with you and saying every day, "Yeah, this is hard. This is really, really hard, but God's got you in it."
So lots and lots of questions.
Great.
A saint for someone who is toxic verbally, maybe verbally abusive.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Cyprian Rugamba would be a good one. He was not a pleasant man to be around. St. Bryce of Tours is pretty good too, and he's lovely because St. Martin of Tours was sort of his adoptive father, but it was like in the context of a monastery, and so it wouldn't have had that same familial relationship. But Martin was abbot of this monastery, and Bryce was raised there, and Bryce was just this like obnoxious jerk, like really just a punk kid, like 18 years old, telling Martin of Tours. Friends, St. Martin of Tours is the first ever person to be universally revered as a saint who hadn't been martyred. Like, he's a huge deal. And Bryce is looking down his nose at him because he's like, well, you were born in a pagan country and I was born in a monastery. And Martin's like, why would that be better to be born in a monastery? Nobody should be born in a monastery, dude. And Martin managed to love him. And Bryce, I mean, he like owned slaves as a monk. Like, he's not a great guy. He's universally uh, loathed by everybody around him. And Martin of Tours just chose to keep loving him. And eventually, after Martin's death, Bryce gets run out of town and he has a conversion and he comes back, and there's great evidence of his holiness and he becomes a saint. But I think it's beautiful to see the relationship there where he's not like horrific, he's not like murdering people, but he's just sort of awful.
One more question, last question. Would you speak on the depression or the darkness that Mother Teresa refers to?
Yes, this I think is the reason that Mother Teresa is going to last as a witness in our church. We have so many people who fed the poor, so many people who bathed lepers, but Mother Teresa doing it for 5 decades in spiritual darkness. I think people need to hear that. I wrote about her in my children's book, and I wrote about this darkness, and it's beautiful to see the reaction of children when I say, do you think that a person could be a saint who never felt happy about Jesus, who didn't like to pray? And they're always like, no, you can't be. And they sort of look ashamed because people don't always like to pray, right? And and then when I say, well, Mother Teresa felt that way, just the look of hope on their faces, telling children, it's okay if prayer is hard. It's okay if you doubt that God even exists sometimes. Like, that's normal and it's natural. And sometimes it's part of the experience of holiness. And so to have Mother Teresa standing there as this incredible woman, I mean, really like the archetype of holiness for the 20th century, right? Everybody's gonna be like, well, I mean, she's no Mother Teresa, right? And to know that she was doing that in that sorrow of darkness, and to know that it's possible also for us to be great saints even in the darkness that we often experience in our spiritual life. I think it just brings such great hope.
Most definitely. Meg, thank you so much. I'm going to hopefully switch over here to this, what I want to show you all. As you know, we always want to offer a discount for you, thanking you for supporting our webinars and all of our presenters. And so we offer you Pray For Us for 25% off using code webinar 1019 for today's date. And that is good through the 29th. This has been so informative, so inspiring. I look forward to how so many people are going to be able to befriend the saints, really get to call them friends through your sharing of these stories and your gift with us. So thank you so much. And we invite you to join us next week. Father Edward Looney will be talking about Marian consecration, the why and the how. So please join us then. Everybody have an excellent day, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.